America's first superhighway, a ribbon of water carved through sheer rock and untamed wilderness, featuring an ingenious network of stone locks and aqueducts. Skeptics called it Clinton's Ditch, but visionaries saw it as the gateway to a gleaming future. Now, the Erie Canal on Modern Marvels. In the woods off Interstate 90 in eastern New York, there's a narrow ditch surrounded by a tangle of weeds. It's a rare remnant of one of America's greatest engineering achievements.
I got a mule and her name is Sal. 15 miles on the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker and a good old pal.
Celebrated in story and song, the Erie Canal first opened for business in 1825. It was the first commercial link between New York and the American West.
Well, the Erie Canal was a breakthrough public works project. It was the most mammoth project ever attempted by this country at the time. It was sweeping in its grandeur. It was a canal for a nation, not just a canal for New York State.
And in very real sense, it united the country in ways that no other event of its time could do. It was indeed a world-famous engineering marvel.
One analogy I like to make is that it's very much like the internet today, that people really viewed it as something that was amazing, that was unprecedented, that was very much changing their lives.
From Albany, New York's capital on the Hudson River, the Erie Canal stretched through a gap between the Appalachian Mountains on the south and the Adirondacks on the north. 363 miles later, it terminated in Buffalo, linking the Great Lakes with the eastern seaboard.
It opened up the entire heartland of the United States to commerce not only with the eastern seaboard, but with the world.
Since its completion in the early 19th century, the Erie Canal has undergone 3 separate reconstructions and upgrades. The original waterway was just 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, but it was big enough to consolidate the strength of a young nation. Its parade of traffic traveled literally at a mule's pace. Led by a young boy called a hoagie, the mules walked a path along the canal and towed boats crowded with cargo and passengers.
There would have been a tow path on this side of the canal. It would have been perfectly quiet. All that one would be hearing, perhaps here, would be the hoof sounds of the towing animals, and the boat would silently glide along.
Boats traveling west on the Erie Canal carried manufactured goods from the industrialized east. Supplies ranging from axes and shovels to dishware and clothing helped settlers develop the new frontier. At the same time, the canal made the rich land and resources of the West accessible to cities east of the Appalachians. Goods such as flour, wood, and pelts filled the canal boats bound for Albany. Once at the capital, the boats were rafted together and towed by steamboats down the Hudson River to New York City. There, supplies were transferred onto larger ocean-going vessels, bound for ports around the globe. But the canal boats carried more than just provisions. They carried the dreams of countless immigrants who hoped to find their fortunes in the bountiful West.
There was a river of humanity that came from Europe to the East Coast and then flowed along the Erie Canal to this port. And then from here, some people stayed, others went farther west on schooners and settled the heartlands of the country. A lot of Americans had ancestors who stood in this piece of land.
Before the canal was built, the only way west for pioneers and merchants was an arduous and expensive trek by wagon. For them, the Erie Canal was a dream come true.
The canal basically took a 6-week trip by wagon down to about 6 to 10 days once it was complete across the state. And then from that point in Buffalo, you could go all the way across the Great Lakes as far as Chicago by water.
Today, the canal is still busy with traffic, but the boats are usually carrying tourists instead of freight.
It really gives them a sense of history. I mean, there's new locks and there's other canals, but if you figure how far this dates back, it gives them a very interesting perspective on travel, you know, from our 500-mile-an-hour jet planes that everybody's used to on the Erie Canal and the locks is quite a different perspective.
Back in the 1780s, almost as soon as the ink was dry on the U.S. Constitution, the new nation began to look for an economical way to push west, to tap the rich resources available in the Western territories. But access to resources wasn't the only reason that the U.S. wanted to link the regions.
It just wasn't economics, because there was a genuine fear by George Washington that if we don't unite these people that are moving into the interior with the eastern seaboard, they might trade with Canada. And they didn't want that economic tie because maybe there would be a political tie.
But America's dreams of expansion faced a formidable obstacle: the Appalachian Mountains. The mountain range that stretches from the southern tip of the Smokies to as far north as Maine was a daunting natural barrier that had slowed Western migration for decades. The American West was simply cut off from the Atlantic coast cities, except at one location.
Fortunately for New York State, as the Appalachian Mountains move northward from Alabama, they veer in Pennsylvania east and then continue north again in what is now primarily New England.
This twist in the mountain chain creates a gorge, which allows the Hudson River to run through. It's the only place where a major river flows from west of the Appalachians to the Atlantic.
Nowhere between Birmingham, Alabama on the south and the St. Lawrence River on the north is there a passage through this eastern mountain chain other than through New York. Nature preordained this path across New York State back 200 million years ago when the Appalachian Mountains formed.
But the Hudson River flowing through this passage runs north-south. What the nation needed was a connection directly west, utilizing the Mohawk River Valley, which ran from Albany to central New York State. The best way to exploit this ancient river route was with a canal.
Water was and still is the cheapest form of transportation, most economical. When you look at per ton mile, it takes a lot less energy and your costs are a lot less. It's a lot smoother. There are no potholes in water like there are in even our today paved roads, much less the old dirt roads.
In the early 19th century, engineers considered canals the logical choice when faced with a daunting transportation challenge. They'd been part of humanity's technological legacy since 4000 BC, when the Egyptian king, Menes, built a canal to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. It may have been in canals very much like these that ancient Egyptians floated blocks of limestone to build the pyramids. Ancient China also forged an enduring legacy of canal building. Workers constructed its Grand Canal 1,400 years ago, linking Beijing, the emperor's capital in the north, with the ocean-going trade of the China coast, south of Shanghai. Commercial traffic moves through it to this day. By the late 18th century, canals abounded in Europe, proving their worth as indispensable components of transportation and commerce. This solid track record wasn't lost on civic leaders in the fledgling United States. In 1800, New York City was just another port on the eastern seaboard. It began to see a canal as the key to its future success.
Well, New York, at the time that the canal opened, was doing pretty well. It was growing, the population was growing. The tonnage going in and out of the harbor was increasing. The value of the goods were increasing. The only trouble is that Philadelphia was still larger, and New York was in very big competition with Philadelphia.
In 1808, the New York State government began to seriously study the possibility of a canal that would link the Hudson River ports of Manhattan to the Great Lakes. The following year, a delegation from New York traveled to Washington, D.C. to request federal funding for a canal to the west. They projected a budget of $5 million. but critics claimed a canal would cost several times that amount.
So there were many naysayers for a lot of different reasons. One was an honest to goodness feeling and perception that it would bankrupt the nation because we were, at that time, essentially a third world nation. We went to the federal government, and Thomas Jefferson said, "My God, fellows, come back in about 100 years and maybe we'll talk about it."
In 1810, almost in defiance of Jefferson's flat refusal, New York's leaders launched a feasibility study for a western waterway. They sent a canal committee to western New York State to examine the possible routes. One of the committee members was a savvy politician named DeWitt Clinton. In 1817, Clinton won the governorship of New York. He championed the proposed canal, which was projected to cost more than twice as much as it cost the state to fight the War of 1812. Budget-conscious state representatives from Manhattan adamantly opposed him. They derided his grandiose vision of a canal, dubbing it Clinton's Ditch. In 1817, the canal bill went before the New York legislature. By a very narrow margin, the bill passed. Clinton knew the political obstacles he had overcome didn't compare to the physical ones that lay ahead. The Mohawk River Valley, through which the canal would pass, was a gauntlet of rugged mountains, icy rivers, and desolate swamps. The severe topography was the result of the same natural forces that had carved the gorge.
In a very real way, the Erie Canal began in western New York 12,000 years ago, geologically speaking. And at one point, the Great Lakes flowed almost due east to the Hudson River down what is now the Mohawk River. And it was those escaping waters from the Great Lakes that actually cut the Mohawk River gorge.
For the canal's designers, the greatest topographic obstacle created by these ancient waters was a pronounced variation in elevation between Lake Erie and the Hudson River. The difference in elevation is 565 feet, and boats can't sail uphill. Nowhere was the shift in elevation more extreme than at the 60-foot-high solid limestone Niagara Escarpment, which creates Niagara Falls, 25 miles to the northwest. Skeptics claimed constructing a canal over such rugged terrain would be impossible. But an army of engineers and laborers was determined to prove them wrong. In the mid-19th century, this site in downtown Buffalo was filled with water. It was a man-made harbor called a commercial slip. The slip was situated at the crucial site where the western terminus of the Erie Canal met the Great Lakes. Here, canal boats that were too small to navigate the lakes crossed paths with lake vessels that were too large for the canal.
The commercial slip was the primary connection between the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes trade. This was a point where cargoes had to be transferred. The cargo had to be moved from one type of vessel to another, and that was a shipment between lake schooners and the canal boats, the smaller canal boats.
Preservationists are beginning to restore the slip to its Erie Canal heyday by removing the dirt that's accumulated here in recent decades. Once the debris is cleared, city officials will fill the slip with water, enabling boats to dock in downtown Buffalo.
Now, this was a real bustling commercial center. We're trying to recreate that site, the flavor, the character, the ambiance of that 19th century site as a way to encourage tourism here in Buffalo and really help people learn and understand the role of the Erie Canal in the history of this country.
At the site, archaeologist Frank Chapatti has unearthed artifacts that reveal how the canal pioneered the way west.
This is something that we find probably in the thousands. They're oyster shells from the East Coast that were shipped in barrels up the canal. And it excited a lot of the Easterners who had moved here or were passing through here because they could finally get fresh oysters.
Beyond fresh Atlantic oysters, just about every commodity imaginable once passed through this commercial nucleus. The Erie Canal made it all possible. 2 centuries ago, the prodigious challenge of designing a waterway through New York's rugged wilderness fell upon 3 determined men. Surveyor James Geddes laid out the canal's route during a scouting expedition through the Mohawk River Valley. Geddes was later joined by geologist Amos Eaton, who later founded Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute, now one of America's premier engineering schools. And heading the entire project was surveyor Benjamin Wright, hailed by many as the father of American civil engineering.
None of these men were professionally trained engineers, and they came to that position either as land surveyors, oftentimes they were trained as mathematicians, oftentimes they were trained as scientists, but none of them were trained as engineers. And in fact, Benjamin Wright had no college education whatsoever, but for that matter, neither did the other 2 men.
There was a little formal engineering knowledge in the sense of formal education, but there was a lot of hands-on, practical men, well-schooled in surveying. They read widely. They knew all about pre-existing canals, especially in England and in France.
The canal's pragmatic designers sought to begin construction on the least challenging terrain. Rather than starting at the rocky and difficult terminals of Buffalo or Albany, they chose to begin at the center of the proposed route, on a wide, flat plain in the village of Rome. Town officials broke ground on the 4th of July, 1817. The canal would be little more than a basic dirt ditch, and its width of only 40 feet and depth of just 4 feet made it slightly smaller than its European counterparts. Builders had determined that 4 feet of water would supply just enough buoyancy for a fully loaded canal boat. And canal commissioners didn't want to pay for anything deeper. The Canal Commission contracted out the labor to farmers who lived along the route proposed by the canal's designers.
Typically, most of the diggers, the general maintenance people, were unskilled laborers. The early diggers on the canal were frankly a pretty rough bunch of people. They were tough. They were there to make a living. It was a well-paying job, actually. But a lot of fights, a lot of labor fights, that type of a thing.
These men were people who were used to hard work and working all day long in all types of weather. And that's what they faced while they dug the canal. The canal was dug usually from spring to fall, and they worked 12 to 16-hour days clearing the land so they could build the ditch.
Essentially, it was from time to time 2,000, 3,000, perhaps 4,000 men working away at from 50 to 75 cents a day to get this ditch built 363 miles across the state of New York.
The canal's laborers relied mostly on picks and shovels and strong backs, but they also developed innovative new tools, like the tree stump puller. The mobile device consisted of 2 wheels, 16 feet in diameter, set on a long axle. Mounted in the middle of the axle was a slightly smaller spool. A rope was wound around the spool and harnessed to a team of horses. A chain wound around the axle was secured to a tree stump. After workers braced the outside wheels, the horses pulled the rope, which turned the axle and wound in the chain. This provided the leverage necessary to extract the stump. Extracting a stump with a pick and shovel might take a lone farmer an entire day or more. Using a tree stump remover, a crew of 7 men and 4 horses could pull out 40 stumps a day. Such ingenuity and sheer brawn resulted in a productive first season of construction. But when the ground froze in November of 1817, crews had to cease work for the winter. They had completed 15 miles of Erie Canal, 348 miles, and the route's most treacherous terrain still remained. These engineering students from Union College in Schenectady, New York, are treading in the footsteps of history. They're restoring a section of the Erie Canal using only the kinds of tools available to the men who built it. What better way to learn about the enormity of the challenge faced by the original workforce?
We could come in here with the backhoes and scramble things around fairly quickly, but we want to teach the students what it was like to build this before you had the major backhoes. We've got students in their mechanics classes that are working with pulleys and mechanical advantage and stuff like that, and engineering hasn't changed a whole lot. The laws of physics hasn't changed.
Perhaps no more fitting classroom than this exists for budding engineers, because the Erie Canal has been called America's first school of engineering. The first 2 seasons of canal construction had been productive. In 1817 and 1818, the canal's builders had dug close to 95 miles of the Erie Canal. But that early progress had been over the flattest and most easily excavated terrain of the route. In 1819, builders would have to cope with more extreme topography, beginning with New York's Great Montezuma Swamp. In March, when the ground began to thaw, workers began digging through the marshy land west of Syracuse. Men worked waist-deep in the swamp, flinging out shovelfuls of mud from holes that immediately filled with mud again. By July, mosquitoes descended on the workers and became a bigger problem than the mud. Malaria, carried by the mosquitoes, spread rapidly through the workforce. An estimated 1,000 laborers fell seriously ill one season, and scores of the afflicted are said to have died. The salvation of the workforce was the early onset of winter in 1819. The cold killed the mosquitoes and froze the swamp, enabling the workers to dig through the firmer terrain and shore up the canal banks with wood pilings. Other obstacles the laborers faced were dozens of streams and rivers, which crisscrossed the canal route and had to be either incorporated into the canal or traversed. To cross the rivers, the workers used a tried-and-true system perfected by the ancient Romans, the aqueduct.
The purpose of an aqueduct was to take your boat from one side of a creek or a river to the other side. It did not lift you or drop you down. The method of holding the water was done by a floor made of timbers 18 inches thick, and then there were 2 walls providing a box. I like to think of it as a rain gutter, and all it did was just take you from one side of the creek to the other side.
The longest of the Erie Canal aqueducts featured 26 50-foot-high arches that spanned more than 1,100 feet of river. Year after year, mile after mile, the workers made steady progress, halting during each winter's freeze, then resuming at the spring thaw. They saved the most difficult obstacle for last: a ridge of solid limestone at the town of Lockport. Its geological name was the Niagara Escarpment.
One of the challenges that the engineers had was getting over the Niagara Escarpment. It held Lake Erie from entering New York State, and to the north you'll find Niagara Falls, which is similar. There's a 30-foot thick layer of limestone and flint. The escarpment itself is 60 feet high.
To traverse the Niagara Escarpment, the canal's designers had to devise a way to get water to flow uphill for 60 feet. The solution to this daunting problem had been engineered 6 centuries earlier by the Dutch. It was known simply as the lock. A lock is a device that lifts or lowers boats from one water level to another. After a boat heading uphill enters the lock, the gates are closed and water flows in, raising the waterline and the vessel. When the water level reaches that of the elevated segment ahead, the gates are opened and the boat proceeds. To move downhill, water is released from the lock, lowering the waterline and the craft. Transporting boats up the 60-foot-high Niagara Escarpment required 5 separate locks in a series. Each lock would raise a boat 12 feet to the next lock, and finally to the top of the ridge. But maneuvering one boat up or down all 5 locks took more than 40 minutes, so the designers devised history's first set of side-by-side or twinned locks to accommodate two-way traffic.
There were actually 10 locks. There was a northern tier and a southern tier, so they could maintain traffic in each direction at the same time, up and down.
The water flow at Lockport was controlled by valves within the wooden gates that separated each lock.
The lockmaster would go to the top of the gate, which originally was 17 feet, 6 inches high. He would use a throw rod, 90 to 180 degrees, cracking the valves themselves. When he opened them up in about this position, water then could flow from the high side into the low side. When the water level was equalized, then the lockmaster, by means of a balance beam, could actually swing the gates up against the wall on one side and swing the gates up against the wall on the opposite side. The boat would then enter or leave the lock itself.
Later in the 20th century, engineers modernized the locks, reducing their number from 5 to 2. The locks were also equipped with motorized gates.
Today's locks, we're going to go through, are 5 stories high. They weigh 50 tons apiece, and they're operated by a 7-horsepower motor. We're going to go up 25 feet. There'll be 3.5 million gallons of water flowing in here, all by gravity. When we first start up in the locks, they can't leave the water in here too fast because it boils up and it gets too rough for the boats. So once we reach the halfway point, then the operator can open up the valves a little bit more, and the water starts to flow in here a little bit faster.
After workers finished building the locks, scaling the Niagara Escarpment, they faced yet another obstacle. They had to blast a 3-mile corridor through the solid limestone wall that blocked the path to Buffalo.
This is a miniature version of what would have been used by the workmen to drill the blast holes for the Lockport cut. They would have used a specially tempered steel rod held by one man, while the other man would hit the top of the rod with a sledgehammer. Essentially, strike, turn, strike, turn.
These holes would be filled with black gunpowder and stuffed with a fuse.
They actually would hire a kid to do it and have the kid light it because it was felt that kids had really good reflexes and they could get out of there faster.
Once the explosion shattered the rock, workers smashed it with sledgehammers and cleared out the debris with shovels and wheelbarrows. This laborious system was eventually replaced by the clever creation of an inventor named Orange Dibble. He built a derrick that could be powered by just 1 horse, but was strong enough to lift 1 ton of stone in a single load.
These derricks were placed every 70 feet along the west bank of the Lockport cut. And so at the bottom of the cut, the men would blast and put debris in these buckets, and then the buckets would be lifted and dropped on the side of the canal.
Dibble's innovation accelerated the work on the escarpment, but it still took laborers 2 years to carve the 3-mile trench to Buffalo. They finished in the autumn of 1825.
And it was, in fact, that last bit of work in the Lockport cut that delayed the opening of the canal, and it was that last piece of work, when finished, that signaled the opening of the entire Erie Canal from Buffalo to New York City.
After 8 years of construction, the Erie Canal was complete. The final price tag was $7 million. At a ceremony in Buffalo on October 26, 1825, Governor DeWitt Clinton boarded a boat named the Seneca Chief and began a triumphant journey down the entire length of the Erie Canal. Towns along the route celebrated his passage with parades and festivals. After 9 days and 363 miles, Clinton's ceremonial regatta entered the Hudson River. When his flotilla reached the New York City harbor, the governor poured a barrel of water from Lake Erie into the Atlantic Ocean in a ceremony called the Wedding of the Waters. The Erie Canal was officially open. Now the real work of America's new superhighway could begin. It's hard to imagine, but these seemingly desolate spots that dot upstate New York were once buzzing with Erie Canal boat traffic.
If you could visualize that this would be filled with water, 4 feet deep, and the water would come up to about a foot below the level of the towpath itself. You'd have boats cruising both east and west at this point, a lot of activity.
It's only fitting that the New York State Thruway parallels the canal's original footprint. In many respects, the Erie Canal was America's first highway, complete with gnarled traffic and rest stops.
What happened was, as the boats came up to these locks, it took time to go through. The little towns blossomed around the lock systems because of this stalled traffic. At every lock, there's going to be a general store. There's going to be a tavern. There's going to be a butcher shop.
Like any well-traveled thoroughfare, the canal had its share of fender benders.
So there were always accidents, bumping locked gates, bumping locked doors, hitting the stonework, hitting each other.
In 1826, the first full year of the Erie Canal's operation, the concept of traffic was a little different than it is today. At any given time, about 160 boats were traveling on the canal. Modest as that figure sounds today, it was proof then that the canal was a triumph for the young nation.
With the opening of the Erie Canal, here was something that not only New Yorkers who had paid for the canal could be proud of, but the whole nation was proud of this canal.
And when the canal first opened, people from all over the world, but particularly from the eastern United States, came up to see it. I mean, it was touted as being this amazing achievement. There were technological feats that people thought would be impossible to accomplish, and so people went out to see it.
Spectators crowding the banks enjoyed a close-up glimpse of the flat-bottomed boats moving methodically east and west. Based upon European models, the boats were usually 14 feet wide and 78 feet long. Each could carry 140,000 pounds of freight, most commonly wheat, lumber, and raw materials from the west, and furniture, tools, clothes, and manufactured goods from the east.
If this was 1850, this boat would be filled in the middle section with cargo, either boxed up or in barrels or in sacks. So this section would be filled from the floor to the ceiling with a lot of cargo.
Tolls, based on the weight of the cargo, were calculated by weightmasters in so-called waylock buildings.
The system is essentially actually like an off-ramp on the thruway, on the highway system, where the trucks would come off. They come off the canal into the chamber. The gates are shut behind them. The water is drained out of the chamber. Once the water's out of the chamber, the boat's resting on a cradle in the bottom, and the boat's weight is pushing that cradle down. The weight of the boat is then recorded on a scale, so the weighmaster is able to then record the loaded weight of the boat. They determine their toll, and off the boat goes.
The average tariff was about a ½ cent per ton per mile. With his boat fully loaded, a merchant paid a toll of around $165 for the entire trip. The Erie Canal became a cash cow for the state of New York.
It was such a success, it paid for all of its construction, all of the operation, all of the maintenance, and showed a profit so large in 10 years that it offset the state budget by 2/3.
A sizable portion of the canal's revenue came from passengers paying by the mile, aboard so-called packet boats. The spirit of their journey was captured in a memorable song.
15 miles on the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker and a good old...
Many enjoyed the journey sitting on the boat's wide roof and watching the scenery roll by. But they had to stay alert, because as a cost-saving measure, the bridges over the Erie Canal were built just 4 feet high. Boat pilots routinely warned passengers with the cry, "Low bridge, everybody down," to remind passengers to duck as they passed beneath them.
Low bridge, everybody down. Low bridge, 'cause we're coming to a town, and you always know your name.
Many avoided this drama by relaxing inside the boat's central cabin.
On the Erie Canal.
When night fell, passengers converted the boat's interior to sleeping rooms with pull-down berths.
The sexes were segregated when it came time to sleep. Men and boys would be on one side of the curtain, and women would be on the other side. So almost every canal boat would have a curtain like this, which would keep things decent during the nighttime.
Canal passengers valued only one thing more than comfortable lodging:
I got a mule and her name is Sal. 15 miles on the Erie Canal.
the tireless mule team propelling them toward their destination.
15 miles on the Erie
The
thing that made the canal so successful was the fact that two animals this size could carry loads as great as 75 ton on a canal boat, as opposed to just a few ton on a wagon.
The mules' abiding companions were the young boys, leading them mile after mile along the towpath.
The boys who worked along the canal were often sheltered in barns alongside their horses, often with just 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night, and then they would pull a boat, and then they would stop and maybe have a few more hours of sleep.
Some 30,000 other workers, including boatmen, lock tenders, toll takers, and repairmen, helped establish the Erie Canal as a booming commercial route that transformed America. Towns along the route, such as Albany, Rochester, and Syracuse, saw their populations explode almost overnight.
They were just basically very few inhabitants until the canal came through. It brought people, they had to stay in places, they had to buy items, and it was quite a economic boom, tremendous boom.
The Erie Canal transformed not only western New York State, but also New York City. The canal's steady shipments of flour and grain made New York the premier port of the United States and its capital of commerce. Despite the canal's success, there were those who opposed it. They rebelled against the way it transformed the economy and accelerated the pace of life.
Some people just didn't like the whole market revolution that was happening at the time. They were suspicious of it. They thought that it was leading to class divisions in society. They thought that it was making people too materialistic.
No matter which side of the issue Americans stood on, nothing could stop the radical march of progress. The changes wrought by the canal would be so great that the canal itself would have to be remade if it were to survive. The Day Peck-and-Paw barge has been a fixture on the Erie Canal since 1921. Today it's passing through the canal's modernized locks, just as it has thousands of times in the past. But this trip is special. The ship is headed to Albany, where it will undergo a major transformation from cargo carrier to historical landmark.
Where it'll be restored, and it'll be a floating museum classroom. And we hope to then be able to take it on the waters of New York State and use it as a public goodwill tour, educational tour, and to bring people back to the canal system again.
Preservationists felt compelled to save the Day Peck-and-Paw from the scrap heap because it's the oldest surviving Erie Canal cargo ship. The Day Peck-and-Paw would never have fit in Clinton's ditch. The supersized canal it now traverses was created because the original waterway was unable to keep pace with a modernizing America. By 1836, the Erie Canal was hailed as an unqualified success for New York and for America. But success brought its own problems.
It didn't take very long into the history of the canal for people to start complaining about how they had to wait when a lock was taking too long, when a boat turned over. The canal, by being so successful, in fact, raised the expectations so high that people were soon quite disappointed with it.
Beginning in 1836, New York officials launched an improvement project, enlarging the canal to accommodate bigger boats in greater numbers.
It went from 40 feet wide to 70 feet wide, from 4 feet deep to 7 feet deep, took out a whole bunch of loops of Clinton's Ditch, made the canal 15 miles, 13 miles shorter. The tonnage of each boat went from 70 to 240. That lowered the cost of transportation even more.
By 1862, the enlargement project was complete, but the canal's increased capacity served only to attract more traffic, and congestion continued. In 1895, officials began yet another improvement and widening project. But it was underfunded and poorly planned. Laborers halted their work when it was only 40% complete. All the while, the beleaguered canal was being challenged by a formidable rival, the railroad. A train could carry more freight and passengers faster and over longer distances than any canal. By the 1890s, many declared that the Erie Canal had outlived its usefulness. New York's energetic governor, Theodore Roosevelt, disagreed. In 1899, 2 years before he would ascend to the presidency, he took bold action to ensure the Erie Canal's survival. Roosevelt appointed a commission to study the state's waterways. This resulted in a $101 million bond measure passed by New York State voters in 1903. It called for the construction of an even larger canal, tailored for 20th century industry. The so-called barge canal was a far cry from Clinton's ditch. It was 125 feet wide, 12 feet deep, and lined with concrete. Vessels on the canal could carry up to 1,600 tons and were powered by motors rather than mules. And engineers installed huge new locks with electric-powered doors. But progress had its price. The barge canal basically erased the engineering marvel that preceded it.
The portions of the Erie that weren't incorporated into the barge canal system were abandoned by the state. In some areas, they remained abandoned up to today. And then in some sections, the canal has been incorporated into the barge canal system. They literally superimposed the barge canal on top of it.
Over the next half-century, the modernized canal became the prime freight route for the state of New York. But by the 1950s, the combined might of the railroads, highways, and larger seaways rendered the canal commercially unviable. Today, however, the Erie Canal is experiencing a rebirth. Cities along the route have refurbished sections of the old waterway to recreate the bygone spirit of its heyday. Replicas of old canal boats take sightseers on tours from Albany to Buffalo. The canal is also enjoying its new image as a recreational attraction. The New York State Canal Corporation has refashioned the old mule towpath for bikers and runners and opened the canal to water sports.
We're seeing more kayaks, we're seeing more canoes. Who would have ever thought canoes and kayakers, you know, going through logs?
The future of the canal is bright, I think, because this waterway can be used in so many different ways.
It's ironic that now this canal that we celebrate, because it seems like it represents a slower pace of life. It seems as though it was a time when life was a lot less complicated. In fact, at the time, was seen as being something that was complicating people's lives, and that was a sign of progress and in no way a sign of the past. Well, I think that the Erie Canal, very much like any technological advances that we see today, did have the effect of raising people's expectations. And so that I think we can see that with anything in our own lifetimes, as well with plane transportation, or most recently with the internet, for example.
The Erie Canal, created in the formative years of the Republic, endures as a symbol of American ingenuity and the pursuit of progress. It remains a treasured institution that conjures rich images of the nation's past. For those who ply its waters today, the refrain of the classic ballad may still ring true.